Shalom, Dr. Deanna Dye here with Foundations in Torah. Welcome back to our teaching on Chanukkah. We left off last time talking about John chapter 9, the blind man. And so the blind man is healed there at the pool of Shiloach, and then he can see. Now, all this is going on, we have the religious leaders showing up who are not happy about this at all. They refuse to believe that the blind man was actually blind. And so they call his parents, and his parents are very clear that he was blind. And the blind man responds to them, all I know is I was blind and now I can see. And so we have lots of spiritual implications with this. It's interesting to me, there's an expression that it was at the pool of Shiloach. The sages tell us that in the shadow of the temple, which is where the pool of Shiloach was, salvation will come. And so Yeshua asked the man, do you trust in me? Do you trust in the Son of Man? You have seen him. He's the one now speaking to you. And then Yeshua goes on to say that he has come to judge the world. So this is important. This is part of the context of the sheep, etc., in John chapter 10. And he says that those who do not see, he's come into the world for those who do not see, that they might see, and that those who do see might become blind. And so this is all temple language, and he's addressing the religious leaders, and in particular, he is dealing with what's happened to the high priesthood because it has become corrupt at this time. So this is a story as well between a contrast between the first and second temple. And so John chapter 9 is all sort of this tabernacle temple language. And not long after the first temple was built, we find the sheep, which are the people who work and service the temple, and the people that participate in the ceremonies have begun to stray. And we see this from Isaiah. We're reading about the Shiloach, that the site would be restored at the pool of Shiloach, because the blind man's kind of the first fruit, if you will. That the people at the time of the first temple had rejected the waters of the Shiloach, meaning because the waters of the Shiloach represented wisdom. I have a whole teaching on Sukkot and the water drawing. It explains that about wisdom. But the Shiloach, the running waters of it, represented wisdom, and so they were rejecting God's wisdom, God's Torah, if you will, and the purpose and the service of the Davidic kings. And so because of their blindness, because of their rejection of wisdom and their rejection of the Davidic line and the Torah, etc., all of this, the blindness came on the people, but it was that the destruction of the temple came because of their blindness. And part of the idea of the blindness meant that let me say their destruction, it came by, described as animals, lions, etc., meant that foreign rulers would come and rule over them, rule over their city, Jerusalem, and over their temple, which of course we see the Romans doing here. Now, 1 Enoch 89, and you can read that, verses 51 through 67, explains the history of Jerusalem and the temple told through Enoch, through his visions. And in that, he uses this imagery of blindness. So it helps us to understand John chapter 9 and 10 a little better. And in that, he also tells us that there's this animal fable about shepherds whose sheep had become blind, and that how these blind sheep became prey to wild animals. So this is symbology of what happened in the first temple and in the second temple here with the Romans. So you can see the connection between that. So let me just read this from 1 Enoch 93. It says, after that, in the 6th week, all who live in it, speaking of the temple, shall be blinded because they have forsaken wisdom. And in it, the 6th week, a man shall ascend, and at its close the house of dominion shall be burned with fire, and the whole race of the chosen root shall be dispersed. So you see this language, this idiomatic language of what went on in the Second Temple period. Certainly the man who rose, Yeshua the Messiah, and then the house of dominion being the temple, being burned with fire by the Romans, and then we see the dispersion of the diaspora of the Jews that had been in Jerusalem at the time, and really in all of Israel. So again, from Enoch, we have another quote. This is 89:50. And it says, and that house became great and broad, and it was built for those sheep. A tower lofty and great was built on the house for the Lord of the sheep, and that the house was low, But the tower was elevated and lofty, and the Lord of the sheep stood on that tower, and they offered a full table before him. So seems a little bit like crazy language, but it has a specific meaning. The language of the temple is always in symbols, but there's something concrete behind it. So we find through various places that the tower signified the Holy of Holies. So when you had a vineyard and a watchtower built, the watchtower represented the Holy of Holies, and the vineyard, the rest of the temple complex. So Isaiah himself is describing the leaders of the returned exiles as blind watchmen, evil shepherds who lacked knowledge, who lacked wisdom. They were shepherds without any understanding, and they had turned to their own ways. You can read that in Isaiah 56:10 through 11. This was all a condemnation of the high priesthood. Ezekiel, of course, was the prophet of Israel in the exile, and he was the one that kept that reminder of rebuilding the temple alive for them. He also condemned the shepherds who failed to care for the people of Israel, to care for the sheep. These shepherds, speaking of the high priests, didn't take care of the sick or the crippled. They kept all the money for themselves. They did not rescue those who had strayed or had become blind. So all of this is what's the backdrop for this. Now, let me read this as well. After that, I saw when they forsook the house of the Lord and his tower, they fell away entirely, and their eyes were blinded. Again, from 1 Enoch 89. And I saw that the Lord forsook their house and their tower and gave them into the hands of lions to tear and devour them into the hand of all wild beasts. So this is how I'm explaining this, because even though this is in language that's unfamiliar, idiomatic language and symbolic language, it has a real meaning. And so this is what this is speaking of. So if we go back to the first temple, which was the pattern for the actual temple in Jerusalem, God himself was Israel's first shepherd. And what God did after the first temple was he committed their pasturing, if you will, to his 70 angels. And this is the language we see in Enoch. So angels represented the high priests. And so the Lord cast the sheep to the 70 shepherds, if you will, the 70 angels, the 70 high priests, to pasture them. And so after the exile, Israel was shepherded by these men. And angels referred to the priesthood or the high priest. Beasts usually referred to men or foreign powers. And if you read in some of for instance, Margaret Barker suggested that the 70 years of Jeremiah's, the prophecy there, and the 70 weeks of Daniel are related to the 70 shepherds or the 70 high priests that go from the period of exile to the return through the time really of the destruction of the second temple. And that the Lord essentially gave them over to these 70 shepherds, and then finally they were given over to the wild animals, who were the foreign nations that would devour or dominate the sheep. And of course, what the foreign nations did was burn the tower and demolish the house, and we see the destruction of the temple in 70 Common Era. So these 70 shepherds had essentially replaced the Lord as shepherds. The high priests and the leaders of Jerusalem were in open conflict with each other throughout that period, and they were hurling many abuses towards one another. The high priests, in fact, themselves used to send servants to seize the tithes due from the lesser priests so that they would starve to death. And in fact, we see the threshing floor here. This is all reported in Josephus. These gangs, these marauding gangs, went to the threshing floor literally and beat those who did not hand over the grain. And so this was the state of affairs. So we have James or Yaakov condemning the rich high priests who lived in luxury and took from the people and took all that the people produced and for themselves, and the high priests did not pay their workers. So all these parables that Yeshua describes about workers not being paid has to do with the second temple and the high priest and what the high priest was involved in. So now we see the sheep have been totally abandoned by their shepherds, and that's happened before the wild animals or the foreigners actually destroyed the temple. This is our second temple period situation. So Enoch tells us that the sheep had lost sight when Jerusalem finally did become subject to foreign rulers. And the punishment then now for losing their sight, their blindness, for rejecting wisdom and for rejecting the Torah, if you will, was the destruction of the temple. Now, in the literature and in some of the writings, we have lists of high priests, but it's far from complete. We know that there were 51 high priests in the Second Temple period. You can read this from J.C. Vanderkamp. He has a book called From Joshua to Caiaphas, High Priests After the Exile. And apparently there were 11 high priests from Uzziah to Jehozadak. So that gives us a total of 62, and that's as much as been recovered. But these shepherds, leaders, high priests, allowed the sheep to be lost. And so you can read about this in Luke 15, for instance, the people, the sheep being lost without a shepherd. But was prophesied that the Lord himself would come to search for the sheep and bring them home. And this is all our temple language. That God would ultimately set up his servant David, which would be Messiah, to be their ruler and restore the covenant. And so Yeshua, being the true Davidic ruler, presented as the Good Shepherd. And so the Good Shepherd and the High Priest are synonymous terms. And so now the great High Priest would be Yeshua himself. And so this is the blind man at Shiloah, his eyes being open because Yeshua healed him with the mud. He anoints the man's eyes, and this is symbolic of eyes being open and wisdom returning, and the darkness being pushed back and light coming forth. When we talk about the lamps with the 7 eyes, this is because the lamp, the menorah, is associated with the anointing and with the wisdom, etc. And so eyes are open, and that's that imagery there. So the blind man, of course, is asking, are you the Messiah? Are you the anointed? Are you the tree of life? All connected to temple language. And of course, the man's eyes were open, and he could see the presence of the Lord. Now, in 1st Enoch, again, and I would encourage you to read it with open eyes, because there's a lot of information in there that helps enlighten us of this, what's going on in Second Temple period. And it says, and I saw till the Lord of the sheep brought a new house, greater and loftier than the first, and set it up in the place of the first, which had been folded up. So in this writing of Enoch, it also tells us about the Lord's judgment on these sheep, on the high priests, the shepherds. And you'll recognize this language because it says that these evil shepherds have been cast into a fiery abyss. And after them, cast into the fiery abyss, were the blinded sheep. So that of course, we recognize the temple being taken away. So the Lord of the sheep was establishing a great new temple for his sheep. And so in today's world, in a spiritual sense, that temple then is the house or the body of all of Messiah. However, it looks to me like it is still in a state of defilement as well. So John chapter 9 has shown us all these ancient images of the day of judgment and judgment on the evil shepherds, that the first temple had been when the Lord was the shepherd over his people. Isaiah 40, 10 through 11 talks about a mighty shepherd bringing his flock home from exile. Jeremiah chapter 23 and 33 talks about looking to a time when the Lord himself would return as the great shepherd to rescue the flock from the evil shepherds who had scattered them. So that's the imagery, and that is the concrete meaning of it. And just this quick quote from Philo, who says that, and the whole creation was like some flock under the hand of God, its king and its shepherd. So you can see it's very much part of the thinking of the first century writers as well. So this takes us to probably the most famous passage of Scripture for most of us, Psalm 23. Now put it back in its context of the first temple. This is very important, that the Lord is my shepherd. So that's what we're talking about. Better him than these corrupt high priests of the second temple. In pastures, the Hebrew word deshe, he lays me down beside resting places. Pastures always referred to the temple itself and the cool waters that come from the temple. He returns my soul and he guides me in cycles of righteousness, referring also to temple services. And then he anoints me. You anointed with oil my head. Now the word there for anointing is not from Mashach or Mashiach, it's Deshen. And Deshen means fat and ashes, and this has to do with a temple offering. And so that's what he's referring to. And he will rest, Shabbati, like Shabbat, and prepare a table. So the oil of anointing here is also connected to the high priest. And we can see that he guides me versus what Yeshua described. The high priests were blind guides leading the people astray. The religious leaders were blind and they made the people blind. Now, John chapter 10, Yeshua goes, we have all these descriptions related to this. We have Yeshua as the gate of the sheepfold. So the gate has to do with the temple, and the sheepfold is the temple itself, the temple complex. And so there is a gate in through which that he represents through the people, that where the people could enter into the temple itself. Now the gate this gate had been closed, and one had to enter through the gate. He is described as the prince, the shepherd of the sheep, and indicating that the glory of the Lord was returning to the house. That those who came before him to lead the flock didn't come through the right gate, and that they came in through another route. These high priests were the ones being described as thieves and robbers that came to kill, steal, and destroy. So we've kind of not understood the context for that. But the flock that would join Yeshua, they are the ones that will be safe and they will find pasture. So again, Yeshua is the door. He has the key to the door, and you can read about that in Revelation 3, 7, and 8. The problem is we've had the wrong door that we've been talking about. Now, I have a picture here, and that's not the right door, but if we'll put up this picture, that is the Nicanor gate, and you see there's 2 wickets on either side. Behind the Nicanor gate, if you can see, is the Great Gate, and that is the gate that we're talking about, the one that's locked, because in the Great Gate there are also 2 wickets on the south and the north, and it is the south wicket on the Great Gate that is the door that was locked, not the eastern gate on the outside wall, but this gate in the Great Gate. When you opened that Great Gate, you went into the holy place where the menorah was, and the holy place was called green pastures. So this is what is being indicated here. Now, Ignatius of Antioch, and this is from something called the Philadelphians 9, in about 100 of the Common Era, he said that the door to the Father was their own high priest who had access to the Holy of Holies. And he was entrusted with secret knowledge, and that was what this access represented. So the secret knowledge, if you will, the wisdom that came from the Menorah, comes from the Holy of Holies. Now, Matthew 23:16, you're all familiar with this. Woe to you, blind guides. He's talking about the priests, the high priests in particular. And not all of the priests were bad by any stretch of the imagination. Certainly you have ones like Nicodemus. But these high priests were leading the sheep astray. They were blinded by lack of wisdom. Again, because the lamp had not been lit, they could not see, that lamp being Messiah. They were essentially eating, instead of from the tree of life, they were eating from the tree of knowledge. We know we have the 2 trees in the midst of the garden. The tree of life represented wisdom. The tree of knowledge represented man's knowledge, if you will. They were blind fools. And it was, Yeshua made the statement, and I would suggest just reading 23, the various verses in there. Yeshua suggested that what they saw was it was more important, the gold or the money and the wealth and the power of the temple, than the temple that made the gold holy. So they were taking oaths, and these oaths were making them look clean on the outside, but on the inside they were totally corrupted. Their hearts had been corrupted by money, power, and commerce, and they had become desperately wicked, and their leadership had corrupted the temple. Now, that doesn't mean the temple's bad. The temple is the construct that God gave us to worship him, but they had defiled it. They had defiled the office. It doesn't make the office bad. Sheep in Jerusalem were basically lost, and the blind guides were leading them. And so we want to be led by in cycles of righteousness. Now, in the midst of all this, in the New Testament, the Gospels, Yeshua also tells the story of a parable of the vineyard, and that he was the son and the heir coming to the vineyard, which had been leased to tenants. The tenants were the current high priests. And the shepherds left in charge. They left the people, basically, and people were defiled because of what they did. And they left the owner of the vineyard. God was away, and so the owner God had forsaken the house and the tower of the sheep. He had abandoned them to wild beasts because of what the high priest did, and they ignored all the servants that the owner sent, for instance, the prophets who came to gather the fruit, if you will, and the vineyard was then given over to others. And so the shepherds / angels, the high priests were judged and their temple was destroyed. And so now we see the Lord of the sheep setting up his new temple through his son, Yeshua the Messiah. And so John chapter 10, dealing with Hanukkah, and here's these phrases. Now we put them back in their context. One who doesn't enter through the door is a thief and a robber, talking about the priest entering not through the door of the Messiah, who is the good shepherd who lays his life down for the sheep. The hired hands those positions were given by the high priests. One who enters by the gate is the sheep's own shepherd. And he says, I am the gate for the sheep, the good shepherd. You enter through me, and there you will find safety and pasture. So he was the only access for the true flock to the true temple, which was their home. And some of this, again, is Holy of Holies language because the high priests were the only ones who could enter into the Holy of Holies. So the hired shepherds, the high priests, had held office since Herod became king in 37 BCE. He appointed the high priest, so by him appointing them, they wouldn't threaten his position. He didn't appoint high priests from the family of the Hasmoneans, who were the rulers at the time. He kept the vestments of the high priest in custody in order to ensure that the people wouldn't plot against him, and he released those garments 7 days before the festival, so the garments could be ritually purified. In fact, when he wanted to marry the daughter of one of these priests, he made her father the high priest. So basically, he had an unholy alliance. And then his son, after his death, and his son Archelaus were removed, the governor of Syria installed the greatest defiler of the temple, and that was Ananias, who was the father-in-law of father-in-law of Ananias. So again, the sheepfold represented the temple. Yeshua said he has other sheepfolds, and so that likely was pointing to the other Jews, Hebrews of the diaspora, to whom the early Christians had taken the gospel. We know that James, Yaakov wrote to the 12 tribes in the diaspora, so this is probably the other sheepfold, and his goal is to join them all together. We know Peter wrote to the folks in Babylon who were still there, and so Yeshua is expressing that under the Good Shepherd, they would be one flock. It would be a vision, again, that we saw going back to Numbers chapter 7 of all 12 tribes receiving the seal, if you will, from Revelation 7. And so the bond between the shepherd and the flock is the same as the bond between Yeshua and the Father. And so this yoke between the two. Now, Ezekiel's vision takes place at New Year's, 572 BCE, and he sees the glory of the Lord returning back through this east gate, the one I just mentioned. And you can read about this in Midot from the Mishnah in chapter 1, but I mentioned the great gate having the two wickets. But he describes as well the earth's foundations being set upon the seas. You can read that in Psalm 24 because it is also a psalm for Rosh Hashanah. And so the holy place this is the holy place, the mountain of God. One enters with clean hands and a pure heart. And he speaks out against, in Psalm 24, against those who make oaths just to deceive or to make themselves look good on the outside. And then it speaks of lifting up your heads, O you gates, lifting up you ancient doors so that the King of glory can come in. Again, all this is a Rosh Hashanah psalm. So let me quickly read this from the Testament of Levi. It says, the heavens shall be opened, and from the temple, glory, sanctification shall come upon him. With fatherly voice as from Abraham, Isaac, and the glory of the Most High shall burst forth upon him, and the spirit of understanding or wisdom and sanctification will rest upon him. He will open the gates of paradise. He shall remove the sword that has threatened since Adam, and he will grant to the saints to eat from the tree of life. So the Qumran community had described their contemporaries. Now, the Qumran, they had gotten out of Dodge. They left Jerusalem, and they went to the area of the Dead Sea to form a community there that was pure and whole. And they patterned their community after Jerusalem and after the temple. In fact, they called it the New Jerusalem, and the pattern of it looked exactly like the pattern or the map, if you will, of Jerusalem. They describe their contemporaries as the last priests of Jerusalem who amassed money and wealth by plundering the people. They were the wicked priests who robbed the poor of their possessions. They were the corrupt priests who plundered the offerings, and they derided the sacred things, and Enoch describes this in great detail. He also describes them as being the apostate generation that came in the 7th week. This, again, Second Temple era. And these priests were idolaters and adulterers and money lovers and arrogant, and on it goes. But that the Lord would raise up a new priest, a new high priest, whose star would rise in the heavens like a king. Certainly, we know, referring to Yeshua the Messiah. All of this, my friends, is the backdrop for Hanukkah in John chapter 10. And it's very important, I think we miss if we don't look at what the culture and structure of the temple was of the day. So we have now we have these blind leaders accusing Yeshua of blasphemy. And they keep pressing him whether he is the Messiah, is he the anointed one. And they had moved far away from the original teaching of the first temple, and so they had great difficulty understanding what Yeshua is saying. They don't recognize who he is, and of course then they prepare to stone him at that time. So that they base the charge of blasphemy from the law of Moshe, in particular Leviticus 24:26 talks about working on the Sabbath and being guilty and being punished by stoning. And Yeshua is saying, I am the high priest. Even though they condemned him for blasphemy, that is, the high priest did, and they recognized, or they determined that his sonship, in which he's speaking about, is also blasphemy. So this is his role then as king, and it had for the high priesthood and for the corrupt priests, it has become the cross then has become the source of mockery. And so even on the cross, we have him mentioned as king, the son of David. These two titles, king and son of David, were honorable titles for the Messiah. And Yeshua, Matthew describes the Messiah, the shepherd of a leaderless flock. And there's just a lot of imagery here connecting king, shepherd, Messiah. And so certainly we understand Yeshua fulfilled all those roles. And so at Hanukkah, Yeshua is claiming himself to be the high priest, the one whom the Father had consecrated and dedicated to be sent into the world, in the same way that they are dedicating the altar. And so in the temple tradition, the high priest was anointed, and he was anointed with a holy oil. It was a perfumed oil from the tree of life. And all this symbolism is basically lost to them. It came from the first temple. And so they were rejecting wisdom, they were rejecting the tree of life, but the anointing and the sonship was the true nature of who Messiah was, and this is what he was declaring at Hanukkah in John chapter 10. So I hope you see Hanukkah in a whole new light, and again, Chag Sameach Hanukkah to you, and I'll see you next time. Shalom, thank you for joining me, and we look forward to our next Hanukkah. Shalom, I hope you've enjoyed today's program. You can check out my website, foundationsintorah.com, for more videos like this one. So sign up today for my free weekly newsletter and consider becoming a monthly member for only $25. Your financial and prayer support of this ministry is greatly appreciated, so thank you.